As we begin, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to get to our speakers. My name is Nina Fernando. I serve as the executive director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. If you don't know, Shoulder to Shoulder is our goal is to build a more inclusive and pluralistic United States of America. And one of the many obstacles to getting there is this problem of anti-Muslim discrimination. As an organization, we orient ourselves in such a way that we believe anti-Muslim discrimination is not just a quote unquote Muslim issue, but rather an issue that impacts us all, that we all have a role to play regardless of our background. As you know, this conversation is featuring Christian authors who have written extensively about Islamophobia. And I want to say what is the obvious. We will not put the burden on any of these scholars to represent Christians everywhere. We will not make the assumption, for example, that they all are aligned and agree and have the same analyses. And we will I hope that all of us enter this conversation with a generous and generative spirit. Be curious, listen with an openness, and engage with what will be shared. I want to again remind everyone as you're joining to please chat with us, with the hosts and co-hosts. Tell us who you are, and tell us if you have any questions or comments along the way. I believe you're able to react to what is being shared, so feel free to do that in that way. And now I want to pass it on to our incredible lineup of speakers. And if you give me one moment, I am going to go ahead and share. My colleague Becca is going to drop in the chat their bios, and if you'd like to click on the links in the bios that you saw on the registration and look into their books and learn more, we welcome you to do that. We won't read through all of their bios, but what we will do is share it in the chat. You are going to hear from Reverends Doctors Anna Piela and Michael Woolf. You will hear from Dr. Todd Green. You will hear from Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner and Dr. Saeed Atif Rizwan, who is going to be our moderator. And thank you again for being with us, and I will pass it over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Nina. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's time and also the privilege of being here with everybody. As Nina said, my name is Saeed Atif Rizwan, and I am Assistant Professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies and Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies program here at CTU. And being at a Catholic institution has given me the opportunity to really think through many different aspects of things when it comes to interreligious studies and dialogue. And one of them is certainly Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And as those who are present here today know that the scourge of Islamophobia continues to be rampant in our popular cultural discourse. Politicians continue to treat Muslims as the other, that are as American as apple pie, and continue to say things that are incredibly hateful and problematic, such as comparing Muslims to dogs and saying that dogs would be preferable to Muslims. And of course, as some of you may know, there is a new anti-Sharia caucus that has emerged out of the state of Texas and is also incredibly, racist and bigoted, and it resurfaces old tropes about Islam and Muslims. And I always find the anti-Sharia stuff, particularly within politics, very fascinating because as politicians, one would assume that they would know the ins and outs of how a government functions, and so they would know that any sort of foreign law cannot be used in the U.S. as per the U.S. Constitution. So clearly, there's something else that's happening with this anti-Sharia rhetoric, and that's directly tied into Islamophobia. We've also seen policies coming out of the administration, the current administration, both in the past and in the current instance, things like the travel ban, which asymmetrically impacts Muslim majority countries and Muslims. and as well as unfortunately several types of different types of hate crimes that are occurring throughout the country. Attacks against mosques, particularly women that wear a hijab, are specifically targeted as well. So there's a lot, that's going on from an anti-Muslim rhetoric standpoint. And so that's something that we'll get into. Of course, with the bad, there's also the good. And the good is in spaces like the way that I'm in. And one anecdote that I just would love to share is that in one of my classes, for my class on Islam, I bring in a Quran reciter. And one time I brought him in, and there was a student who was in a religious order, and he heard the Quran, and he tweeted, I just listened to the most beautiful recitation and praising of God. And that was something that he experienced for the first time. And it was something that was impactful. And it's really a beautiful way of sharing something, even with our own faith commitments and within the purviews of our faith. So there's a lot to discuss here. I don't want to take up all the airspace here, certainly. And so what I'd like to do right away now is to switch to questions for these esteemed panelists, who I'm very curious to hear their responses as well. So to my dear panelists, each of you come from a different Christian denomination or background, yet all of you have been compelled to write books about Islamophobia. So the question is, why? Is there a particular moment or experience that motivated you to write the book or crystallize the idea for it? Why don't I invite Jordan to start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Jordan Denari Duffner, and I'm scholar in residence here with the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. For me, when I think back on the story that kind of eventually led to my book on Islamophobia, it all actually goes back to my days in high school and the days of chain email messages. Even before social media, when the way that we spread information in a mass way was through chain emails. And there was one afternoon when I was sitting at our family's desktop computer, and I saw an email come in from a family friend of ours in our Catholic parish. And it was this kind of anti-Muslim screed, basically casting all Muslims as a threat, saying that there really is no such thing as a moderate Muslim. And I saw that this email had circulated through our Catholic community, through all these different people in our parish before it reached us. And it was really a gut punch, because this was during a time, this was, I think, in the kind of late 2000s. It's where it's still the Iraq War period, kind of not 9/11 was earlier in the decade, and it was really the height of a lot of anti-Muslim feeling, but in a way where the public wasn't really naming it Islamophobia or seeing it as a problem yet. And I was also myself kind of going through this personal spiritual journey of learning about Islam, but from a Catholic background. So I am beginning to be engaged in interreligious dialogue, and thought, the version of Islam and the stereotype of Muslims that my Catholic community has does not match at all the Muslims that I know and the Islam that I know. And so I saw this disconnect between also the stated values that we as Catholics and Christians hold, love of neighbor, hospitality, welcome, sharing, again, just loving our neighbor, was not at all in alignment with this anti-Muslim chain email message that people were passing along. But they didn't realize that. My community didn't realize this disconnect between our stated values and the way we're actually treating other people. And so, about 10 years later, I finally write this book on Islamophobia, kind of an outgrowth of my research and work that I was doing at the time with the Bridge Initiative. And my book is called Islamophobia: What Christians Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination, because I really wanted to be able to write to my own faith community out of our idiom, like out of our own kind of theological and ethical language, to both diagnose the problem of Islamophobia through a faith lens, but also figure out how we can draw on the resources that we have in our faith tradition to address this form of Islamophobia. So I'll stop there, but that was kind of the motivation for me as a Catholic.
Thank you so much for sharing that journey, Jordan. How about I turn it over to Anna and Michael?
Thanks. So my sort of anti-Islamophobic journey, if I can call it that way, does not start with my faith. it actually starts with the origins of my sort of academic career. It's my first project after my PhD project was a study of experiences of Muslim women who wear the niqab. So I interviewed 40 women, and that study was triggered by my deep interest in the views of those women. That was in the context of the niqab bans that were happening all across Europe at the time, and so everybody at the time was, everybody felt like they could offer their opinion on the niqab, on whether it should be worn or not, and they were voicing those opinions. Politicians, regular people asked, in the streets, newspapers, commentators. But I come from a feminist strand of sociology where you ask the women concerned when there is an issue like that, and there was literally zero. Comments made by women who wear the niqab. Nobody bothered to speak to them. So that was when I thought, I need to speak and find out, why they wear it. And I want to hear it from them, not from people who just, have an opinion. And that was a really, really interesting sort of example of Islamophobia, in that it was not necessarily always framed as, oh, this is creeping Islamization of Europe, or this is a extremism. I mean, that also exists, but the discourse that bothered me very much was people who said we need to ban the niqab to protect these women's rights, and that has been a very strong discourse in France, where this secular discourse of women's rights completely ignores the views and opinions of women concerned. So this is what I call soft Islamophobia. People who are very well-meaning, maybe even liberals, progressives, and they say, Muslim women are better off without Islam because it impinges on their rights. They should just abandon it. And so that's one type of Islamophobia that interests me very much personally. But by studying, the niqab and the stereotypes, I was digging deeper and deeper into history of it. And of course, Orientalism in the 17th and 18th, 19th century, that period is very, very often sort of mentioned as the beginning of those tropes. But when we worked on our book, Michael and I actually managed to sort of find very early sources from Christian writings, where these tropes of Islam as a satanic faith, or the Prophet Muhammad as as sort of Antichrist, those tropes were actually introduced in the 9th century, very early on. And so basically the history of Christianity from the moment Islam came on the scene is also the history of sort of Christian creating, mobilizing, reproducing those tropes for their own purposes, such as, for example, colonial conquest, territorial conquest in the Middle East. So all that sort of converged, and at this point, in America in 2026, 25, 26, I think that there was a need for such a book that Michael and I wrote, but we will say more about it. Why particularly, what we wrote, we think is useful for Christian communities. We talk about it later, but that was my story.
Thank you so much. Yes, the niqab ban is always fascinating, right? Because during COVID, take off the niqab, but then put on the face mask, right? But anyways, go ahead, Michael, please.
Oh no, I think I don't want to talk even more about the book, but the only thing that I'll say is from the pastoral side, it sort of emerged from a long-standing sense of conviction that that as Baptists we really believe in something like religious liberty, and that's been a key part from the 17th century of our sort of tradition. And we even have some interesting resources around diverse theological opinions and learning from each other and all these sorts of things, but it hasn't really been sort of cohesively developed into an interfaith theology, and that was a project that seemed really important as we find our pluralistic democracy increasingly sort of fraying at the edges. So we thought that would be important.
Thank you so much, Michael. Todd?
Thanks. It's great to hear these stories. It's always fascinating to find how we arrived where we did, which is usually not so meticulously planned out when we're younger. So my venture into the study of Islamophobia obviously was not something I was thinking about when I was a kid. As a kid, I thought I wanted to be Indiana Jones and an archaeologist, and I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that was really cool. I even took some archaeology classes in college and discovered that, wow, it's not at all like Indiana Jones. But my childhood in terms of religion was interesting. I grew up in a Presbyterian church in Mobile, Alabama, so in the very deep South. And I knew by the time I was, say, 10 or 11 that the messages I was hearing at the time, at least in Southern Alabama and the Deep South, which was dominated really by evangelical conservative Christianity, did not resonate with me and at times frightened me. I remember a big billboard driving up Interstate 65 from Mobile toward Birmingham, Alabama, when I would visit relatives. And there's this big billboard on the side of the road that would say, "Go to church or the devil will get you." And there was a devil and there was flames and there was a pitchfork. And I was fascinated by that billboard. But that billboard was my introduction to theology, really. It was not fun theology. And it didn't resonate with me. And so by the time I was 10 or 11, I was probably pretty agnostic. I just didn't have the word for it. And you don't grow up in the 1970s and 80s in Alabama and come out of your agnostic closet so easily. So I kept that to myself by and large until college. And it's a much more complicated journey, but eventually I sort of revisited and came back to my Presbyterian identity. My first career was actually as a Presbyterian minister. But I still had a strong dose of agnosticism that remains to this day. That's another conversation for another time. But all that's to say is I grew up in Alabama feeling a little bit like an outsider, like I didn't quite fit into the dominant religious culture. And when I entered into adulthood, it was just sort of natural for me to gravitate towards people who also found themselves somehow on the outside when it came to religion, however they defined that, whether not part of the Christian tradition, part of a minority religious tradition, agnostic, atheist, secular, humanist, whatever. And so I became increasingly interested in minority religious and secular communities and how they engaged with the majority. And that ultimately found its way into my scholarship when I went back to do a PhD at Vanderbilt and then began as a professor, which leads to the books I wrote. I've written two books, one called The Fear of Islam, which is a survey of Islamophobia in Europe and the United States, historically and contemporary survey. And then there's a book called Presumed Guilty, Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism, which is a little bit more of a broader analysis on the trope of Muslims as inherently violent and inherently prone to terrorism and what that trope really is covering or distracting us from in terms of the majority populations of the United States and Europe. I will say that was still a bit of an accident getting into the study of Islamophobia after grad school. I was doing some research actually initially in Muslim minority communities in Europe around the time that Switzerland banned the construction of minarets. This was around 2009. And I remember at the time just asking a very simple question: what's threatening about a minaret? In a country that only had four of them, none of them particularly tall, none of them were used for the call to prayer, but the far right party, the Swiss People's Party, felt absolutely necessary that they needed to call a referendum to ask the Swiss people to vote to ban this and amend the constitution, which seemed like, mildly, let's say this, as an overreach, right? An overreaction. And from there, I ended up studying mosque conflicts in Europe as well and publishing some of this right around the time of the so-called Ground Zero mosque controversy in New York City, which then sucked me into the area of public scholarship and media engagement, which is what then turned me into deciding I as a scholar who should be writing more on this. And The Fear of Islam came out first time in 2015 in the first edition, in part because I was trying to write a survey book in a field that was just emerging. And there weren't a lot of broad survey books to be used in college classrooms. So part of it was that, really. And also trying to tie what's going on in Europe to the United States, as opposed to keeping those two so distinct that we don't understand that there's a lot of mutual influence and Islamophobia doesn't have any geographical boundaries in some ways. And then Presumed Guilty was just the ongoing incessant narrative that Muslims never condemn terrorism, that they're prone to violence. And I was interrogating that very narrative that existed on both sides of the political spectrum. And really, to what extent does that narrative distract white Christian Americans and Europeans from coming to terms with their own violent past and their ongoing complicity in a violent world order. And that's these violent narratives projected on the Muslim communities distract us from telling those stories and engaging with that history. So that's why I wrote that book.
Thank you so much for these rich stories and very fascinating. So just moving along, speaking of books, can each of you or can you as a group describe your book for everybody here? If you can walk us through what we can find inside these books, right? And of course, you can feel free to talk about how people can use the book for those who maybe have not accessed it, or those that have, maybe are new, fresh ways to think about it. Obviously, you don't know the ways in which they think about it, but perhaps they'll learn something from what you may have to share with us. So with that, I'll have Anna and Michael start the conversation.
Our book is trying to do many things. I can just sort of, from my memory, what the chapters are. We do provide a very brief primer on Islam, and we try to sort of center the very pluralistic context in which Islam emerged, to show the different influences of those different faiths and on the early Muslim community. We also talk about the complicity of Christianity in Islamophobia, anti-Muslim prejudice, right from the very, very beginning, as well as currently. And then so the audience for our book, we originally thought, probably Christian clergy who never had much kind of chance to learn about Islam or create partnerships with Muslims. And so we wanted to see where we are within our denomination. And we also we did this survey among American Baptist pastors, clergy, just to find out how much they know, how much in education they had a chance, had the chance to kind of take advantage of in college or in divinity school, and how they're handling interfaith work right now. So we have the results of that survey in one of the chapters, and then. I think a really, really important part of the book, probably the most important actually, is the theological kind of contribution, where we say, we need to employ this concept of holy envy that was introduced by a theologian, Swedish theologian, Lutheran, Christer Stendhal, and then developed by Barbara Brown Taylor in her book Holy Envy. So basically, we need to approach other faiths generously, and with assumption that there will be something within those faiths, whether in practice or theology or lived experience, that we will admire, that perhaps our own faith does not have it. And so with this sort of approach, with this attitude, we should, that's how we should start to kind of create a relationship with our Muslim neighbors. And for the clergy, we wanted to also say, yes, it is totally okay to bring in Islamic scripture to liturgy. And so we created this sort of resource where it's kind of ordered by the lectionary, the Christian lectionary, the texts that are assigned to specific Sundays in this 3-year cycle. And we pointed out that specific Islamic texts from the Quran or from the Hadith have, the direct relationship, logical relationship or substantive relationship to what is read out on that particular Sunday. So, we cover Jesus, we cover Mary, we cover various prophets as well as Islamic practices. And so we're hoping that this will help clergy to actually do a dive into Islamic scripture and sort of be able to creatively apply it to their own preaching or adult education at churches, book clubs, various different kind of contexts. So, yeah.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to add?
No, I think Anna covered it.
Okay, great. How about I go to Todd?
Yeah, thanks. Well, as I said, I've got 2 books on Islamophobia. The first one's called The Fear of Islam, An Introduction to Islamophobia in the West, and it is both a historical survey of Islamophobia and a contemporary analysis of it, and it focuses on both sides of the Atlantic, Europe and the United States. Part of what I'm trying to do in that introductory book is just to tell that history, particularly because after 9/11, we had a little bit of historical amnesia. in the United States, at least amongst other places, in terms of where Islamophobia came from, when it really started, and not a deeper recognition that this wasn't just a response to 19 hijackers on September 11th, 2001. That there's a much longer standing anti-Muslim prejudice that was embedded in Western cultures and histories and societies, and we needed to really go back to the origins, Islam's emergence on the historical scene, and how it started to come into tension with and conflict with European Christian kingdoms and empires. So you had basically empires in tension with each other for larger political gains. And for much of that history, Islamic empires had the upper hand. They were much more advanced militarily, culturally, politically than Europe. Europe in the Middle Ages was really the backwoods. And then this really starts to change in the 16th century and really by the 18th and 19th century, where European empires are on the ascendancy in terms of the other part of the world. And a good chunk of what we now know as Africa and Asia came under some kind of European colonial or imperial presence or rule in the 19th and early 20th centuries. That includes a lot of what we know today as Muslim majority regions. So that colonial history is extremely important to me to understanding, frankly, even 9/11, much less the Cold War, the other tensions that were going on geopolitically that placed the United States in a particular position when it came to Muslim majority populations and its involvement in the Middle East. And so I tell a lot of that history. And then get into 9/11, which is a little bit more of a conventional treatment of that. And then I get into the contemporary ways that this has played out in Europe and the United States with from hijab and niqab bans to freedom of religion issues, mosque conflicts that existed on both sides of the Atlantic, the rise of far-right parties, that sort of thing. I also have a chapter on the media and how the media is incredibly influential in shaping our narratives of what we think of as Muslims or Islam. And our understanding of Muslim majority context, which the vast majority of Americans have never visited. But we've seen the movies, right? And we can go back to the silent movies to talk about the history of Orientalism and the way Muslim majority context have been narrated to Western audiences. So I get into a lot of that in the book, and it really is meant to be a broad survey, a kind of a first entry into this, as opposed to a deep dive into any one of those things, and to connect the dots between Europe and the United States, as well as the differences. The biggest difference I note in the book is that Europe's history, both pre-modern and even modern, is much stronger in regulating religion, regulating public expressions of religion. So a niqab or a hijab ban that you'd see in France would be much, much more difficult to pull off in the United States, which is not to disregard the bigotry that would still exist here in the United States, or does still exist, but actually creating a law to ban it. That fits France and its particular model of laïcité and secularism, and also just fits a little bit more of a European mindset that you can regulate public expressions of religion. So in the United States, Islamophobia plays out a little bit differently in the legal system than it does in Europe, and I did want to call attention to that. The book Presumed Guilty on why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism. Part of that was born out of my frustration of just these narratives in the media and politicians and public figures calling upon Muslims to condemn terrorism. And really just the lack of historical knowledge that many people here, and particularly in the media and political platforms, have, or at least expressed when it came to the history of Europe and the United States and violence. Part of what I do in that book is just note in a very boring way, frankly, just how often Muslims have been condemning terrorism. This idea that Muslims don't condemn terrorism says less about what Muslims have been doing and more about why we don't know that, the rest of us, right? And why people on MSNBC or CNN or Fox or sometimes in the New York Times don't know that. Tom Friedman once called out Muslims for not speaking out against terrorism enough, and the New York Times actually published this massive page after 9/11 with all these signatories of people, Muslim leaders, condemning the 9/11 attacks. And then you have one of its own writers saying later that he hasn't really encountered many Muslims doing this, and so it just baffles the mind, right? How he could not know that from his own newspaper. But it's also reflective of a larger problem. And that problem, I think, is how in the United States and in a lot of Europe, we struggle, and the majority populations struggle to come to terms with their own violent history. And just the one illustration I'll use for this is about something I get really interested in, is how we memorialize violence, public memories of violence. Germany, for all of its many faults in the 20th century, and even in the late century, I was just trying to come to terms with the Holocaust. Nonetheless, it did move in the direction of more public memorials for the Holocaust, right? There was some, in fits and starts for sure, and some reluctance here and there, but there was this effort that we have to publicly remember this and as a way of engaging this history. And I'm just curious about that. When do we decide that a violent act or episode in history is worth memorializing in that way? In the United States, we have examples of that with Pearl Harbor, memorializing that. The one that came to me right before I started writing this book was the 9/11 Memorial Museum in Lower Manhattan, which I visited not long after it opened. I found it a fascinating place and a troubling place. It was emotionally heavy. It tugged on the heartstrings. But if you knew very little about the Cold War and where Al Qaeda was born from, you would not leave that museum having any more knowledge about that than when you entered into it. It doesn't give you any context for why 9/11 happened. It just tries to bring you back to that day and the feeling of that day, which I'm old enough to remember. It was an emotionally laden day and a time. But would you actually come away with better knowledge of the context and why that happened? No, you wouldn't. And I was curious about that. Why we were not adding that context to that public memory of 9/11, that it was going to be focused on bringing us back to the emotions and the horror of the day, but not to the historical context that led up to it, including the Soviet-Afghan War and the birth of Al Qaeda coming out of the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviets at that time. So I was curious about that, and I also was fascinated by how quickly that museum was built compared to Bryan Stevenson in Alabama, and how much effort it took to create the first national memorial for lynchings, which is a violent episode in history that a lot of Americans in general, maybe even white Americans, don't really want to memorialize. But we're very quick to memorialize the 9/11 attacks. Why is that? That's a question, a historical question. It's a moral question. I remember reading a local news account in Montgomery, Alabama, when that memorial to lynchings was established or is about to be opened. And there were some local people in Montgomery who's like, well, the Equal Justice Initiative and Bryan Stevenson, they can do whatever they want to do, but I wish they wouldn't dredge up history like that. And I just really fixated on that phrase. So when we build a memorial to 9/11, that's not dredging up history. When we build a memorial to Pearl Harbor, that's not dredging up history. But when we build a memorial to lynchings, all of a sudden we're dredging up history. What explains the difference, right? And that's the kind of stuff I got into that book, and that's the kind of conversation I wanted to initiate with it. If we want to talk about violence and religion or violence and politics, let's do it. But let's be honest about it, and let's do an honest assessment of the broader history of the United States and Europe and its own complicity and some horrific violence in the past and the present, before we can have any sort of honest conversations about Muslims and violence or terrorism.
Thank you so much, Todd. Just real quickly, if you can just give a quick kind of overview on how folks can use your books, either one of them or both of them.
For mine, the Fear of Islam is really a survey book. It's just meant to introduce you to the history and the contemporary sort of pieces of this. There are a lot of other books that do better jobs of going into deep dives on the media or on particular religious traditions, or particular historical episodes such as the Crusades or the colonial 19th, 20th century history. But mine is just sort of meant to be the first introduction. That wrote it for the classroom. It's been used in other contexts in churches as well, and it's meant for a lay audience, if you will. I try to write it with not a lot of jargon. Presume guilty. I really was right. When I say why we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism, I note in the beginning of the book, it's a rhetorical we. It's not we doesn't necessarily mean everyone. It really means people with my cultural, racial, and religious background primarily. And then others are sort of invited to read it as well, to recognize some of the dynamics going on there. But I recognize that there was a particular segment of the United States and Europe that was really where a lot of these obstacles were being encountered when it comes to the knowledge of this violent history and how this history is being told. And so I direct that book to them, and it can be used in churches, it can be used in reading groups. That book's also a very quick read. You can read it in a day.
Great. Thank you so much. Jordan?
Sure. So before I talk about my Islamophobia book, I'll tell you all about a shorter and free resource that in some ways is a distillation of the Islamophobia book. And this is a pamphlet on Islamophobia that I recently published through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops called Islamophobia, a guide for Catholics, or the name is something like that. And it's free for download on the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website. And there I summarize, again, the problem of Islamophobia sort of with a Catholic Christian audience in mind. I talk a little bit about the history of Catholic-Muslim relations, things that the church and popes have said about Islam. And then I offer some concrete suggestions for things that Catholics can do to address Islamophobia. So I'd first just point people in the direction of that. The book on Islamophobia tries to do a few different things. The first section of it is meant to be kind of like Todd's book, an overall survey of the problem of Islamophobia that Christians or non-Christians could use. And I know that a number of professor friends have used at least that portion of the book in courses that they teach on Islam or Islamophobia. And so in that section, what I really try to do is address a number of misconceptions or myths that readers might be coming to the book with. And again, I'm thinking, when I have the word Islamophobia in my book title. So I think that people who pick up my book are going to at least believe that this is a problem. They're not going to be allergic to that term. But I still think that people who know that Islamophobia is a problem still might be coming to it with some misconceptions about how Islamophobia works or about Muslims. And so, I talk about how, Islamophobia is not just a post-Donald Trump issue, going back to 9/11 and all these other things that Todd and Anna and Michael have already spoken about. I talk again about how Islamophobia exists on both the political right and the political left. And I spend a lot of time talking about liberal forms of Islamophobia too. I talk about forms of Islamophobia that kind of operate under the surface. And I spend a lot of time talking about implicit bias and some of the latent stereotypes that we might be holding on to. And then I address some of those stereotypes head on as well. So I do the sort of typical explanation about, what is jihad, what is Sharia, what is the hijab, those sorts of things. That's not actually the primary goal of the book, because in some ways what I want readers to understand is that these stereotypes and these tropes are, to sort of go back to Todd's point, kind of a distraction. And it's a form of scapegoating. These labels, these tropes, these stereotypes have been leveled against lots of different minority or immigrant or other communities in the United States. And so one of the things that I really want Catholics to get out of a book like this is recognition that the same tropes that were leveled against us and plenty of other groups in American history are now being ascribed to Muslims. And I think sometimes even just the recognition of that this is a political tool is helpful for people, even more than like knowing the ins and outs of Sharia or jihad or what have you. The second half of my book really focuses on Christians and the way that Christians have contributed to Islamophobia, but then can also be part of the solution. And so I talk about contemporary Christian Islamophobia. I recount some of the amazing books and studies that have been done on evangelical Islamophobia, but because that has received a lot of attention already, from other scholars, I spend a lot of time talking about what I call and I have identified as the Catholic wing of the Islamophobia industry. A lot of my time at the Bridge Initiative was spent sort of looking at how this sort of national cadre of bloggers, pundits, commentators, things like that, have shaped the conversations about Muslims nationally, but then also how they were also shaping Catholic discussions and views of Islam. So, for example, I, would go down to the National Basilica Library, a bookstore, which is not far from where I live here in the Washington, D.C. area. And I remember coming across a book by Robert Spencer, who is, or at least at the time, was Catholic, and he wrote this book on Islam for a Catholic audience. But people picking up that book probably didn't know that he was also responsible for the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, the anti-Sharia hysteria of like the 2010s, and all these other moments of national Islamophobia. And so I wanted to draw attention to some of those connections. I also talk about the history of Muslim-Christian relations, again, going back to some of these episodes and trends that Anna and Todd were talking about. But then at the end of the book, and this is, what I feel like is for me most exciting and the main contribution of the book is I draw on Catholic, theology, scripture, biblical tradition, and what we call Catholic social teaching to help Catholics see Islamophobia through the lens of our faith tradition and then kind of imagine ways that we can help us overcome that. And so I frame Islamophobia through the lens of these different principles of Catholic social teaching. This idea that Islamophobia is an infringement on human dignity, that we have to be concerned about the common good, And I talk about also about these principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, these different tools that we as Catholics have to kind of envision what our role is in addressing this form of discrimination. I think Islamophobia isn't typically included in our sort of top line list of like social justice issues that Catholics should care about. But I hope it can be. And also, I hope it can be viewed as a religious liberty, a religious freedom issue. And I think, depending on the audience that we're talking to, it's helpful to frame this issue in those different ways. So I hope that this book can be used in classrooms, but also in church communities, book clubs, and things like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jordan. Really, again, rich perspectives, and hopefully those online can take away a lot from this and also from the books that each of these authors have written. If we can talk a little bit about, state of Islamophobia, let's say today, see like who is harmed from Islamophobia, right? Who and who benefits from Islamophobia? And within that, is Islamophobia situated to one side of the spectrum when we think about the spectrum of from liberals to conservatives, or is it spread throughout? So if each of you can talk a little bit about these questions, and here I'd like to start with Todd.
Great questions. Who's harmed by Islamophobia, for example? Well, Muslims, obviously, and directly, and most importantly, people perceived or coded or racialized as Muslims can also be harmed by Islamophobia. Think about the first retaliatory murder after the 9/11 attacks. That was a Sikh gentleman in Arizona outside of his own gas station, where the perpetrator assumed he was Muslim. Just because of headwear, beard, color of his skin, right? And this is the important piece I think we should call attention to about Islamophobia is just to what extent this is a form of racism itself, and Muslims and other peoples are racialized in a way that puts them in this category, and then people respond accordingly or act accordingly. So there's that in terms of the hate crimes and the violence. You think of Muslim populations abroad in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others where there was massive displacement during the war on terror, a lot of civilian deaths. They're impacted a lot by Islamophobia to the extent that Islamophobia was driving some of the foreign policy and the military action that was taking place in the war on terror, including maybe the anxieties that were circulating around weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which may have been fed in part by a lot of implicit prejudice that many people may have had, where they were willing to go along with something that clearly had no evidence to back it up, right? So there's that. And then in the end, I would say we're all harmed by Islamophobia to the extent that it distorts, say here in the United States, it distorts our aspirations for a pluralistic, democratically diverse society, to the extent that people of all religious orientations, identities, and no religious orientation identity have a place at the table, have gifts to contribute to the broader society, to the functioning and the flourishing of the United States of America. And if there's any kind of prejudice that limits those contributions or creates barriers to those contributions, then we all suffer. I wrote a piece earlier about people from Iran and other Muslim majority countries who do a lot of healthcare research and the medical professions here in the United States, and the challenges that might have come from the Trump administration when it came to banning student visas and people coming into the United States back in the spring when this was such a big deal on campuses with Muslim students being taken and put in detention. I want a country where anyone from any part of the world can come to the United States and do research on pancreatic cancer. I want that because I am a widower. My wife died of pancreatic cancer. So if any of you ever have a loved one or you yourselves are subject to that horrific diagnosis, do we not want all hands on deck for that? Irrespective of their race, religion, cultural background? Of course we do. That's America. That's America at its best. So we all suffer. If there's a prejudice that prevents immigration from certain countries based upon religion, religious identity, cultural identity, and that sort of thing, and here domestically in the United States. To the last part of the question, I'll just say this. I see it's a pervasive problem across the political spectrum here in the United States. It's a mistake to assume that Islamophobia is primarily a conservative political problem. I think I've heard everyone say on this call at some point that there's a problem with liberal Islamophobia and we need to pay more attention to it, which I wholeheartedly agree. My takeaway on the mainstreaming of political Islamophobia in the past 25 years is this. The Republican Party's message increasingly, particularly starting around the first time Obama ran for the presidency and really taking off in the 2010s, was to just narrate this idea of an American, which Muslim identity and American identity can't go together. Muslims can't really belong, and that has become mainstream in, unfortunately, some significant parts of the Republican Party, which is very overt. It's not subtle. It's horrific, but it has worked in terms of leveraging certain segments of the population. The Democratic Party, I think its message increasingly has been, no, 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 no. There are some good Muslims. We like the good Muslims. The good Muslims are the ones who support our national security apparatus, support our foreign policy, support the decisions we make when it comes to military violence, whether that's in or supporting other military endeavors, whether that's Israel, Gaza, whether that's Iraq, whether that's Afghanistan, or whatever, right? And good Muslims don't question that. They know their place. They're grateful. They accept that this is the country that they're in, and this is the way the nation should run its affairs. And they don't call attention to prejudice or point fingers or anything like that. We want Muslims to be complicit and compliant and keep their heads down. And we like those kind of Muslims. And that's been the problem with the Democratic Party. So when you have Muslims who don't conform to that, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and increasingly a younger generation of Muslims who didn't grow up in the same way in post 9/11 and who have been far more assertive, as we see on college campuses, with their opinions, you have a Democratic Party that does not know what to do with that because they're not behaving. They're not conforming. And so that's the problem with the Democratic Party. It's a pervasive problem. It's just, is there a place for the good Muslim? And of course, in the study of Islamophobia, the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy is itself a massive problem, something that has to be interrogated and deconstructed, because there's no comparable dichotomy for the good Presbyterian, bad Presbyterian. I don't ever have to worry about that.
Thank you for those pointed comments, especially about the rhetoric within the Democratic Party. I think that's incredibly important for people to understand what type of position that's put Muslims. And of course, it completely ignores the rich history of African-American Muslims, right? And where that fits into the constellation of Muslims in America and the ways in which African-American Muslims are part of civil rights movements. And of course, how those Muslims have been sidelined or proscribed from, think about memorialized memory about civil rights, right? And what that looks like, and even the sanitization of individuals, even like MLK Jr. and what that means. So thank you so much for those comments. I'll turn it over.
If I can add one
Sure.
more, this is my very personal view, but in my view, what's going on currently in Gaza is also driven by Islamophobia. I don't think what's going on is I don't think this is just because of American love for Israel. I think it is also Islamophobia toward Palestinian Muslims, and 2% of Palestinian Christians does not redeem the whole view of Palestinians as, Muslim terrorists or Hamas. That whole narrative. It is very much squarely sort of related to general views of Muslims, stereotypes of Muslims that we see.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a really important point, and I do want to come back to it as well in a different kind of focus. But that's a really important point to raise as well. Thank you so much, Jordan. Your thoughts on the same question, just so we can get some parity with everyone about who's harmed, who benefits, on the spectrum about Islamophobia. Just a similar question to you.
Yeah, so for the question of who benefits from Islamophobia, I mean, you talked a little bit in your introduction about the anti-Sharia hysteria that's coming back again, and there have been some really good analyses in lots of different news outlets, Politico, New York Times, et cetera, about how, we're in a midterm year again, and Republicans have found in the past that kind of creating this boogeyman of the Muslim or of Sharia is a really useful campaign tool. So basically they say, okay, there's this problem of Muslims in Texas or the threat of Sharia law. I'm going to pitch myself as the person who can best, crack down on that in comparison to the other people I'm running against. And that worked, back in the 2010s and, into the first Trump campaign, which saw all of this rhetoric as well. And so I think politicians have found that Islamophobia can often be a winning strategy. And so they're using that again now. In terms of who's harmed by Islamophobia, we've talked about all the ways that Muslims and then people who are often seen or perceived as Muslim are negatively impacted. But I think also that as Christians, as non-Muslim people of faith, we are also harmed by Islamophobia when we allow it to fester in our communities. I do think that this is a form of, holding prejudice and discriminating against Muslims is a form of, individual and also communal sin. I think we need to think of it in those terms. A number of years ago, when I was more active on Twitter, I posted something about Islamophobia and just I don't remember what the exact hate crime or case was, but one of the kind of prominent anti-Muslim bloggers on the internet at the time responded and said something like, "Oh, here's Jordan telling us that Islamophobia is a sin." And I was like, "Well, I hadn't said that, but actually, you're right. Like, thank you for helping me to realize, like, we need to see this as something that's not just fracturing our relationship with others, but also harms our relationship with God." I go back to Pope Francis on this all the time. He said, if our relationship with people of other faiths or people of other backgrounds is frayed or if there's a problem there, that calls into question our own humanity and also our relationship with God. And so and I saw this in my own faith community too, this disconnect that I talked about before, that we proclaim these values and then we don't live up to them, and so I think if we want to sort of right that wrong and fix that disconnect, that's important for us to do.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Michael, Anna?
Yeah, I think our other two esteemed panelists have really said everything that I wanted to say, but I think that what I was thinking about most for how the folks that are harmed is I think that it's really important for Christians to understand that they harm their own spiritual lives, and that it's a corrosive influence. It's bad for your soul to participate in Islamophobia. I think the more that we can sort of articulate that around a vision of God's presence and God's embodiment here on earth, when you read something like Matthew 25 and you think about how God is not just saying that people who are vulnerable are just nice people that God really likes especially, but there's actually sort of a push that God is identified with those people, and how we treat them is how we're treating Jesus. I think that all the tools are there. It's just sometimes we fail to articulate. And I think we're human beings. I think the more that we can sort of articulate theological visions and also ways of saying, this is really your problem. The more you participate in this, the more you distance yourself from God, and that it has a real corrosive effect on you and your spiritual life. I think that is going to be a little bit better, at least for talking to Christians in Christian community. So I think that's really important. Other people who benefit from Islamophobia that I see are, I think that we're in a real interesting moment where I think all social media that we have in the United States will eventually be treated like smoking, in that we kind of knew it was bad for us, but it's going to take some major trial to see, basically, for all of Americans to sort of see the corrosive effects that's had on our democracy and on our individual and corporate life. But I think that the people who really benefit also from Islamophobia happen to be the folks who maintain our algorithms and who feed us hate-based content and keep you scrolling on TikTok as you listen to people dehumanize others. So I think that's a key group of people who really benefits from Islamophobia discourse. And I think that they're helping spread it, but also making a lot of money doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that even before social media, right, and just in the media itself, right, you punch up the local news, is it more interesting to hear about a Muslim who's helping with microfinancing for, women in poverty in Bangladesh, or, somebody yelling Allahu Akbar, right? And which makes for good, sensationalist news, then more people, dial into that. And then, whatever corporate benefits come from that. So absolutely right. So a question came in through the chat, and I just want to read it to maintain full transparency and authenticity to the question. And as I read it, I definitely have some thoughts about it too. But I'm obviously really would like for you all to respond to it, which is this: What is the best way for Americans to display their anger and contempt at events that happen around the world or in the US by Muslims that are destructive and blatant terrorism? How do we share our thoughts in a generic manner and not Muslim specific? How do we respectfully approach Muslims with our concerns? And here, I'm not going to call anybody, so please just jump in, popcorn style, so to say, and give your perspective.
So is the question really, how can we blame Muslims in a polite way? Because, yeah, I mean, yes, we should probably be able to say all lives matter. I mean, all human life matters. It's the value of human life should be a priority for everybody. But yeah, perhaps one way to do it that would not be offensive would be to do it in a manner that acknowledges white nationalist terrorism that happens here, and then without pointing fingers at one particular group, to admit that all groups have these kinds of elements, and that it is our responsibility to deal with them, especially within our groups. So,
Right. I think what you're alluding to, Anna, which is that when it comes to violence, there's a certain pathologization that happens with Muslims, that somehow it's inherent to Muslims, but not to others, right? And so if one wants to criticize a Muslim who carries out a horrible act, then criticize that horrible act not because that person is Muslim, because the act is horrible, right? Just in the way that you're articulating that someone should that if a white supremacist carries out a horrible act, you criticize it for the act. Um, so there is a human beings are human beings, and the way violence maps on to a human being isn't different based on one's religious commitments, right? It's much more on what the social context is of a human being. So, in that way, to your point, it's if one wants to criticize a Muslim for shooting somebody, then they better be ready to criticize somebody in the U.S. that shoots somebody for another reason, right? And not as a function of their religious identity. Michael, I know you're kind of at the edge of your seat and nodding, so do you want to add something to it in a particular way?
I don't know. I mean, like, I'm a white Christian pastor, and I've never been sort of called on to give some sort of account for Christians who do evil things in the world. And I think that that's really important to note, that not once has that ever sort of happened in my pastoral career. And I think it is really important, obviously, when we see dehumanization, when we see these sorts of acts, to try to articulate the values that we want to inculcate. And part of what we've been left with in this country is they really made people feel bad about virtue signaling. So now all we have left is vice signaling. So I think that being able to say values that you approve of in the world, including interfaith cooperation, is a really good thing. And criticizing things that obviously dehumanize others or take others' life is fine. But the people who do that are not sort of predisposed to do that because they're Muslim. I mean, if you look at all sorts of crimes that are happening around and dehumanizing acts, man, I would have a line out the door if I was forced to give an account for all the Christians who use their faith to do astoundingly evil acts in the world. So I just think that whenever we're talking about this, it seems like there's a double logic, and it seems like one group of players, specifically the hegemonic religious group in America, Christians, they get a pass, and other groups like Muslims are treated as inherently violent. And I think that that's a big problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this. It's a tough question to figure out how to respond to, because in some ways this is what my entire book, Presumed Guilty, was about. But I want to add, yeah, we should condemn any kind of unjust, horrific violence that takes place, irrespective of who the perpetrator is. The larger question is, do we really think that Muslims aren't getting criticized enough for violence connected to their name? My God, I think it's the exact opposite. Muslims get so much criticism that the idea that 19 hijackers on 9/11 do what they did, and then every Muslim in the United States has to somehow prove to the rest of us that they're not connected to that, right? And even if they try to prove that, they're still objects of suspicion. That's not something I have to deal with. To Michael's point, when Dylan Roof opened fire in a Charleston church in 2015, not a single soul, then and now, this is 11 years later, has ever asked me to condemn that. Why? Yeah, I actually have some similarities. He was a Southerner. I'm a Southerner. He's white. I'm white. He had at least a little bit of a Lutheran background. I used to teach at a Lutheran college. But no one is lumping me into him. I'm afforded individuality as a white Christian. I'm given the benefit of the doubt. Muslims are not. So if we're going to have this conversation in a nuanced way, we got to interrogate that, right? That those assumptions of why would that not be expected of me? Or when young white men open fire and do mass murder, which is a far greater problem in this country than anything that we call Muslim terrorism. Why would not be expected to condemn that or call attention to that? So there's a bigger question here about the assumptions, and when communities are treated as collectives, which is what Muslims are, racialized that way, and then therefore they're collectively presumed to be guilty until they somehow can prove otherwise, and that's not something that's placed upon me as well. And this collective guilt is a deep problem in American history, and it's not just Muslims that have been subject to that. The historical example often uses the internment of Japanese Americans and with President Roosevelt's order in 1944. Why were they interned? Because all these Japanese Americans had done something wrong? No. Not for what they did, it was for who they were. A racial ethnic background that made them presumed guilty. They were treated as a collective. You'll never see white Lutherans rounded up in America and interned as part of some larger collective and horrific entity because Dylan Roof did what he did. Or because of any other even more mass atrocity, right? It's not how the racialized thinking around violence works in America.
No, thank you. Jordan, did you want to add anything?
No, I think my colleagues have said everything really well, and I wouldn't have much more. I'd just be replicating what they said. So thank you.
Okay. I wanted to ask this question. We talked about it in the sense that Anna touched on it, and it's really important when thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, which is that, many times, oftentimes, it's been the case that in public and academic discourses, anti-Palestinian and Arab sentiments are often conflated with anti-Muslim bigotry. And in other words, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian bigotry become stand-ins for one another. So in your work, how do you navigate this issue and make people aware of it, especially when at times the conflation is unconscious? And what about the ways in which institutions would rather even avoid the potential of being called anti-Semitic than actually being Islamophobic? And I'll invite you all to, I don't want to keep picking, so whoever feels like, but yeah, so please go ahead.
I mean, what I'm seeing is that very often Islamophobia is used as cover to sort of cover the general Muslim question and avoid addressing the Palestine question. So you will have interfaith organizations that, are kind of, arguably big on fighting Islamophobia. They will push out resources, but yeah, they will be very silent on what's going on in Palestine. So that's what I'm seeing, but that does not exactly answer your question. So I'll leave it to others on the panel.
A few thoughts come to mind. I mean, I think you're right, Saeed, that anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian bigotry in some ways has a lot of overlaps. I think, again, because people assume that all Arabs and Palestinians are Muslim, a lot of the stereotypes about Muslims get applied to those communities. I think to Anna's point earlier, I think, some American support for the war in Gaza was colored by not seeing Palestinians as fully human and again, through some of those anti-Muslim tropes that then get to ascribe to everyone. So I think there definitely is a way that Islamophobia is connected to these other forms of bigotry around identity and language. What I also want to say is that I think sometimes, since October 7th, since the war and genocide in Gaza, there's this way that, in the US context, we talk a lot about, Islamophobia versus anti-Semitism. This idea that the reverberations here are all about people being either Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, and sort of this assumption that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic, that Jews are inherently anti-Muslim. And so it gets sort of played out in this way, which I think is really harmful on a number of levels. It also, I think, maybe most tragically, like, abdicates Christians of any compulsion to actually be involved in this and recognize our own complicity or recognize our own connectedness to this, whether that means like the existence of Palestinian Christians, or even recognizing that we have Christian political leaders who have been involved in events abroad. So I want to draw folks' attention to a resource that we did here at Shoulder to Shoulder that came out in 2024, where we talk about how anti-Muslim tropes, anti-Semitic tropes, things like that play into American discourse on Israel-Palestine, but that it also can't be reduced to that. A few months ago, I was invited to give a talk for an organization, kind of a Islamophobia 101 talk. And I realized after the fact that the reason why they called us in to do this was because there had been some kind of episode or issue that they identified as like a religious bigotry issue that kind of precipitated them doing these different trainings on different forms of bigotry. Well, in talking to the participants, I realized that the actual problematic interaction that occurred was actually a Palestine-Israel conflict thing. It was someone was wearing a Free Palestine shirt, which offended someone else, and then it sort of devolved into this whole thing. And after I learned that, I realized what these people actually don't need. They don't need an Islamophobia or an Islam 101 training. This is about something broader and more political, frankly. But people are, because they see Palestinians as Muslim and they see Israelis as Jews, they just kind of default go to Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. And I think that is something that it's really important that we kind of disentangle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll also take a bite on the question about institutions being afraid to be called anti-Semitic, and they would rather be actually Islamophobic than be accused of anti-Semitism. I think since October 7th, we've really seen weaponization of anti-Semitism and and that accusation, and a really coordinated push to define anti-Semitism as being criticism of Israel or criticism of the genocide that's going on. And so that's a very powerful push. It's not only backed by money, but a lot of political power right now. And there are real repercussions for speech around that. And so I think that what we are dealing with, again, Jordan really said very clearly that in a lovely way, I think, about how the situation in Gaza, people sort of map on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to really what's happening in that region of the world. And I think institutions, we're finding out in this moment in democracy that a lot of institutions didn't have the courage or didn't have the capacity that we might have hoped that they would. And so I think we're finding that out through this administration for the past year, who has been able to sort of walk through various institutions in our democracy and sort of convert them to their will pretty easily, it seems like. And so I think that we are really at a point where we have we have a courage issue, but I do think it's really important that there is a lot of money and power behind that accusation. You were talking about the Randy Fine comparing Muslims to dogs, and that dogs were preferable to Muslims. I couldn't ever imagine such a statement being made about our Jewish friends and neighbors in Congress, and what would sort of happen if he made that comment, for instance. So I
Right.
think that it's definitely this sort of double standard, and our institutions are very ill-equipped to handle that double standard and the disparity in power and money behind these separate issues.
Right. Thank you.
I'll second all that. I mean, it's is Islamophobia a broad politically recognized category, and moral category at that we would be afraid to be labeled. It's pretty clear if we've learned anything in the past 25 years, and particularly the past 15, that in fact, if you actually lean into embracing Islamophobia and peddling it, it could be helpful to your political career. In some parts of the country, it might even help you get to the White House. And if you were overtly anti-Semitic, I don't think that would be the case, which is not a way of saying that there isn't real problems with anti-Semitism in America right now, but there is broader recognition that that's a bigotry and it's a moral issue, right? And that's just not the case with Islamophobia. I hope that changes within the next generation, but we've seen some disturbing trends going in the opposite direction, unfortunately. If not the last 15 years, and frankly, the past year or two. I think the other thing I want to just call attention to here, because I think it's probably one of the most important topics in the present about the addressing Islamophobia in the United States in the current political environment, which is very difficult. And that is the extent to which anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are played off of each other politically. And yes, that can happen from people within each of the impacted communities, but it often happens by being driven by people outside of both communities. There is a vested interest in playing these two prejudices off each other, amplifying the concerns or the experiences of one community over against the other, pitting Jews and Muslims against each other, back to Jordan's point, as if there's some sort of inherent conflict that's supposed to exist between these two, and it's just an ontological reality, to use a religion jargon. But it's not, it's not sort of conditioned by current political circumstances. And the data actually says something different about that here in the United States. And then also history says something much more nuanced about the relationship between these two communities. The other thing I tend to want to tell audiences is just how much anti-Semitism, Islamophobia share in common in terms of their modern histories, and particularly the drivers, the catalysts. Nationalism and racism, and the intersection of those two things. You can't understand modern anti-Semitism, including the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, apart from those two realities. And you can't understand modern Islamophobia apart from the ways that usually far-right nationalisms combined with some sort of racialization and racism pits or creates a category of national belonging or identity that's over against Muslims. Muslims don't really belong. Happens here in America in certain segments of the political spectrum. It happens a lot in Europe as well. I can think of some other parts of the world where that's happening. But there is a lot that they share in common, and there's even some common tropes. The idea that Muslims are liars, they're practicing taqiyya, we can't trust them, they're not honest, is analogous to the shifty Jew. All right, and you can take 3 or 4 major tropes and find that these are similar, and sometimes they've been applied to Catholics and other religious communities as well. Not all of this is particularly creative or inventive, by the way. It's recycling old stuff with quote unquote newer communities or perceived newer communities. But the most important thing we have to do in the study of Islamophobia, I think, right now, and calling attention to it, one of the most important things is to recognize the way these two prejudices are being played off of each other right now, and neither community is helped by that. Both of them are going to be negatively impacted by that in the long run. And we have to call attention to that dynamic, particularly when there are politicians outside of both communities that are wielding that as a weapon almost in order to gain political leverage. It's a significant harm, and frankly, it could be have deadly consequences for both of these communities if it's not addressed sooner rather than later.
Right. I mean, I think, not to sound too from a 30,000-foot view, but hate cannot be compartmentalized, right? And so it's about, anti-Black hate, right? It's about Islamophobia. It's about anti-Semitism, right? There's all these different ways that these negative hates, the negative hate comes through, right? And so to think that somehow it can be compartmentalized is completely absurd. And I think it's a really important point that you're underscoring. We just have, we're running out of time. There's so much to still go through, but we've talked a lot about, and we've unpacked what Islamophobia is, the scourge of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And rather than, just leaving it at unpacking and deconstructing, I'd like to ask each of you about constructing. In other words, what brings you hope and what are concrete steps or things that people can do in addressing Islamophobia? Where in your work are you seeing movement and change on these issues that you'd want to share with us? And here, I think if I remember the order correctly, Todd, you go first. So why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. When I was first studying Islamophobia and writing on it, I wrote my first draft of The Fear of Islam. I was also teaching a course on Islamophobia at the time. And the first time I taught the course, 14 weeks of all the historical political manifestations of Islamophobia, all that was wrong, right? It's really dark. And I didn't have anything, except a few things along the way about how do you respond to Islamophobia. My students, they let me have it on the course evaluations. Like why would you bring us into 14 weeks of, going into the gutters of humanity and human beings acting on their worst impulses and not give us some hope, right? And so I've been much more attentive to that since then, and I'm grateful for that feedback. And I end up adding a chapter at the end of that book precisely to address, how we can go forward in countering Islamophobia. I'll say a couple of things. One, if you look at the recent data from the Institute for Social and Policy Understanding, ISPU, their Islamophobia poll, one of the things I find interesting in that poll that's been pretty consistent since they've been doing the Islamophobia poll is that when you look at, generally speaking, faith communities and their attitudes towards Muslims and to what extent they hold to Islamophobic tropes, Jews almost always rank at the bottom. They're among the least likely to be Islamophobic. There might have been one year in there where they were bumped up a little bit more, but for the most part, Jews consistently rank at the bottom. Despite every narrative we encounter in the media and in politics and Hollywood that these are two communities that are supposed to be in conflict with each other and hate each other, here's a very recent poll. It was conducted last year. Ultimately, it was released in, I think, November of 2025. That consistently suggests no, there's plenty to work on here. There's plenty to build on. And there's other things in that poll that shows some overlap in terms of general political, those two, Jews and Muslims, are the least likely to support Trump, irrespective of what gains Trump may have made in 2024. On the whole, Muslims and Jews tend to be very much in opposition to President Trump's policies. Take that for what you want, but there's some commonality there. They both overwhelmingly don't believe there should be any displacement of Gazans from Palestinians from Gaza, despite the rhetoric coming out of the White House earlier last year. So, there's things that are in common there that are important to point out. The other thing I tend to point out, and I do it a lot in my work with Interfaith America, is the importance of relationships, pluralism, broadly speaking. This is rooted in intergroup contact theory, but relationships don't change everything. I'm not saying that, but they can be game changers. They can move the needle. Some of the polling I was mentioning a while ago, if you look at all those ISPU polls, you often find that white evangelicals are usually the most likely to be Islamophobic, and they're almost always the least likely to know a Muslim. And we should take that correlation seriously. And then when you go down, the scale, you have groups that are least likely to be Islamophobic that are more likely to have a Muslim friend or a colleague or a relationship. So we got to do more in building these relationships without telling all Muslims who make up about 1% of the population, you need to go make a lot of Christian friends, by the way, so that the rest of us don't come out after you. That's not quite my messaging, but building relationships across religious differences has a major impact. It's not the only thing we need to be doing, but it's a significant thing we should be doing, try to be doing more of, and trying to push back on the policies, the initiatives, the political obstacles that sometimes make that work incredibly difficult, and particularly in the current context. So there's other things I can mention. I'm sure my colleagues will mention, but I wanted to point that one out.
Okay. Thank you so much. Jordan?
Sure. I think there's a few things that that people can do right now. I have a laundry list in my book, but I'll give just a few of them. I think right now in this moment with the rise in different forms of Islamophobia that we're seeing, it's really important that Christian and Catholic voices and institutions express their solidarity and support for Muslims. And with the confluence of Lent and Ramadan, I think there's a really natural way to do that through Ramadan well wishes or just other sort of public statements. I think it really means a lot to people when they know that what their community is going through is at least being seen by others, and that their support there. Another thing that I have found that works really well in at least upending or beginning to kind of bring to the surface individual anti-Muslim feelings or stereotypes is this process of kind of just like personal internal reflection. In the Catholic tradition, we might call it an examination of conscience when it comes to our biases or views about Muslims. One of the things that I have done in both of my books is talk about experiences when I realized that I was actually operating out of an anti-Muslim stereotype. And I actually tell those stories to my readers and to my audiences, because I think in narrating that, we kind of give others permission to reflect critically on the biases, or, even implicit ones that we didn't even know we had, that we're walking around with. And I've had people come up to me and say, I didn't actually realize that I was thinking this way about Muslims, and I now realize that was really harmful. And I don't think it would have been helpful for me to be like chastising them for that, but rather telling people about my own journey of like uncomfortably unlearning some of those stereotypes myself. I think gives people permission and an invitational way to do that. And so that's just a piece of advice that I would give to people here.
Thanks, Jordan. Anna and Michael?
Yeah, I've got an example which is actually does not involve Muslims, but we had a tense moment recently. In December, we had a very controversial nativity scene outside the church, and our Jewish neighbors came and basically kept guard of the nativity during our Sunday service, and I was shocked. I was shocked at this expression of solidarity, and they kind of they anticipated that something might happen. There might be some boycott. Somebody might come in and start making trouble, and they were there guarding that nativity, and I just didn't know what to say. And I think I would like to take this for me myself as a lesson, for when hate crime happens, or where there is potential for hate crime. Just standing by the afflicted, targeted community means a lot. And it can really help build relationships.
Thank you.
I've got a fair amount of hope. One of the things that we found in our survey is that a lot of people want to do more, but they have no idea where to start. And another thing that gives me hope, obviously, because I think that people, if they had the right resources, might be able to do more. And I think that these books perhaps give people resources, which is really important. The other thing is, as a pastor, I have been in a million meetings where people wring their hands about the decline of religion in the West, and all about how people don't go to church anymore, and et cetera, and what are we going to do about it? And it's true. I think that for Christians, there's less people in church these days, but these communities still have the power and ability to form people. Most of the time, they are primary sites of learning for people about other religions. And most of that learning tends to be not so great. But that also should be a point of hope, I think, for Christian communities just a little bit, because they still have power there. They still can form hearts and minds. So if they move people towards interfaith learning and learning about other religious traditions and seeing them as pure traditions with interesting insights about God, or interesting insights about our humanity and our shared endeavor here on this planet, then they really can move the needle, and they can really become powerful sites that challenge Islamophobia and challenge all these sort of different forms of hate that we see in the world. And I think that really can help build a pluralistic democracy and help rebuild that. So I think there's some optimism that I have about the fact that just because the people are learning about other religions poorly doesn't mean that always has to be true. In fact, they could form people to really be brave actors in this time, which is what we need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, if I can add my own perspective, in terms of hope, is that obviously with Ramadan starting, it's almost becoming ubiquitous to see its recognition. It's quite remarkable, not only just from friends who send messages of well wishes, but even I went to the grocery store, and it's like, do you have your fresh Ramadan iftar meals ready, right? And I just wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago, so to say, right? And so, yes, there's a commercialization issue, and I get that too, but but there's still the idea that that there are waves of and streams of ways in which Muslims are seen as much more part of the American fabric is really important, right? And certainly as we continue to bring in and center more of our African American Muslim sisters and brothers too, to really show the long history and the long reach of Islam in America as well. And I think that combination is certainly showing itself more and more, and that gives me hope. And I'm here at a Catholic school teaching about Islam as a self-identifying Muslim, and I have many students who are Catholic, and being able to talk to them. So there are spaces, and I think through exposure and through connection is really the way to move forward. And you all give me hope. I said it in private, and I'll just go on the public record that you put together this panel, and you're doing this work which does not come for free. I know for the things that you have said, there is a cost to it, right? And it is being Jesus like, if I can say that, is that there was a social cost, a political cost, and ultimately his life that he had to pay for what he stood up for his truth to power. And I don't want to preach, but I just want to say is that I deeply, deeply respect and appreciate, and I think I can say that. Yes, I cannot speak for 1.8 billion Muslims, but I think I can say it with confidence that Muslims appreciate, and I certainly appreciate everything that you all are doing, and you are the hope, right? And you are what will help carry us forward. So I just want to personally say thank you for doing the work that you're doing. Thank you for being in partnership and being in these faith communities together. And it means a lot. And may God Almighty bless you and reward you for all that you're doing. And so with that, thank you everyone for joining today. And I'll turn it over to Nina for some final words.
Thank you so much. We are all applauding each of you for taking the time to share. And we only scratched the surface, believe it or not. We had more questions that we could have gone through. And I really encourage all of you to check out these books. We did discuss the possibility of a book club of sorts. If people are interested, we are very open to that. I shared a link to a survey, a very short survey in the chat. Please take a moment and fill it out. And if you are interested in exploring any or all of the books with our authors, I know that they would be interested in that. I just have a few things to share. I want to say thanks again to our speakers, thanks especially to Jordan Denari Duffner and to my colleague Becca Tybel for working the back end here of this program. I want to just name a few things. One is at Shoulder to Shoulder, we really encourage our networks to learn about and engage with Muslims and even Islam as a religion outside of an Islamophobia lens. So I want to just name that because while we talked so much about Islamophobia, we are all human beings and we are so much more than the bigotry that we face. So I want to name that. We have at Shoulder to Shoulder an annual Ramadan campaign. This is an effort to uplift and map iftars open to guests of all backgrounds, interfaith iftars around the country. Thank you, Becca, for sharing it in the chat. Invite you to join if you are not attending. Encourage you to look one up and find one, and let us know if you are hosting. We'd love to map that and mark that. Happy to answer any questions about it. We also, this Ramadan and beyond, and especially in light of our upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the U.S., we have this screening challenge, and it's for a PBS docuseries, American Muslims: A History Revealed. And we just invite you to watch at least one episode yourself or with others and reflect on it. What does it teach you about American Muslims, about American history more broadly? And we hope that this is a generative, forward-looking, insightful conversation that will unfold from that. Also, please join our mailing list. You'll find out for more opportunities like this, virtual events like this, in-person events. We follow us on social media. That's another place to learn about events, but also what's happening in the world, what's happening here in the United States, and our perspectives on it. We every month share out resource roundups, which is essentially a very messy and long list of opportunities, resources, articles, calls to action related to the work that we do. Jordan has a new column that she's been writing for us called Lines of Encounter. We invite you to engage and read through on that. Shoulder to Shoulder has a number of resources. Someone had mentioned in the chat about school curriculum. We have a long list of resources for educators that includes curriculum ideas, among other resources. So check that out. We do dive deep into for example, what is Islamophobia? How does it show up in society? What can we do about it? How can I talk about it as a clergy or a faith leader in a way that is effective, that will reach people? What can I do about it? What are some strategies and tactics? That's our Faith Over Fear training. I'm happy to share more about that. And so those are just a few invitations I want to invite you to. Please do take a moment and fill out that survey, and tell us what you think, what you're reflecting on this conversation. Any questions you have, you can do it anonymously or include your contact. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope you all leave with some new insights and inspirations. Thank you.